Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today I wanted to address a trend that I'm seeing occur at a pretty fast rate within the fishing world, and that's simply that there are very few wooden topwater baits around anymore. Most of the ones that are still around are ones that were around 30 years ago, so they've never really changed from wooden to plastic models, but very few new baits are being made out of wood. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. There are definitely some positives to wood baits, and there are definitely some negatives. So I want to go ahead and address those. Today's video is brought to you by the Deep Dive app, which will help you select the best fishing places in the lake with features like the lake level, the current flow, the top baits tool, which will help you select the best baits for certain locations throughout the lake. Whether that's a clear water, stained water, dirty water, it'll choose the best bait for that location, provide you with all the information like what structure, what retrieve, different reel, all of the information that you need to catch the fish. This is in the app. The cool part about this app, though, is it's not just based on areas. It does provide you with specific tournament winning data that has been collected to help you figure out your best choices for baits and locations for whatever region of the lake it is that you want to fish. On top of that, not only does the app provide you with best locations, it gives you water clarity as well. So maybe you're on a lake like Lake Eufaula, where there is a bunch of different water clarity located throughout the entire lake. This will help you identify the clearest portions as well as the dirtiest portions of the lake. Plus, the Deep Dive app has now added the wind effect map, which is going to take all of the different wind conditions for the past couple of days and show you what banks on the lake are being hit the hardest. They also have inflow points that show you different places throughout the lake where your water is being flushed into the lake through different ditches and creeks and rivers, providing you with high percentage places to fish and letting you know what parts of the lake are going to be the best areas after a rain. Check out the Deep Dive app to help you become a better angler. So for me, one of the first experiences I had with a wooden bait was with a devil's horse right here. So this is a Smithwick devil's horse. And one of the things that I found with this is I had been fishing in northern Wisconsin. I got a muskie to bite it. I ended up catching the muskie. It was just a small, like 30-inch fish. But when I went to unhook it, the fish literally had speared one of his teeth like through the bait and they just clamped down on it. So none of my hooks were actually in that fish's mouth. It was the fish just holding onto my bait that hard that kind of made me start thinking, okay, well, that's interesting. Why didn't I actually get the hooks to like bury into the fish's mouth? And really, what happens with a muskie or bigger fish like that, and it's not just muskie, you see it with walleye, most of your toothy critters, you see it with dogfish, you see it with snakeheads. If there's a bait that they can clamp on and actually compress that bait, you're not going to be able to set the hook and like pull that bait through the fish's mouth to get the hooks to catch on anything. So that is a big negative when you're talking about fishing with wooden baits. Now that problem is not nearly as much of a problem when you're talking about fishing for bass. But I can assure you, in the muskie world, we've seen a huge wave from wooden baits, topwater baits, and actually all muskie baits to more of the plastic baits because of that. You don't want the fish to be able to compress their mouth or their teeth into the bait because you can't move the bait when you go to set the hook. So I do think that some of that is actually rolled over into the bass world as well, where it just makes more sense where you could potentially have a bait that's going to hold up better because it's made out of plastic and it's going to be something that the fish can't compress, and therefore you can set the hook with that bait by pulling it through the fish's mouth. Now, again, that's more of a toothy critter problem than a bass problem. But again, it is something that I think we have to be aware of. So that is one issue. Another issue that we see with respect to your wooden baits is the castability of them. Most of them do not carry the same weight that your plastic ones do. Most of them do not have a weight transfer system that you're starting to see in most of your plastic baits. So from that standpoint, you don't cast as far, and a lot of times your casting accuracy isn't as good either because the bait tends to flutter in the air and therefore go off course. So I think that's something that's pushing people away from it a little bit. You also have some issues where you start looking at some of the different hardware mounting options. Now, if you've got some that have kind of your wire through forms, those are okay. But in some instances, you start seeing some of your hooks actually pulling out of the wood. If you are using some of these screw-in models, there is some issues that come into play with your hardware because if you're hand carving the bait, you're running into some potential issues with what you can do with that bait versus molding a plastic bait. Another thing that you have to keep in mind anytime that you're fishing wood baits is generally they're quieter than your plastic baits. And what I mean by that is even if you don't have rattles in it, when you have a hook that hits against the wood, it's more of a dull thud versus a hook that hits against a plastic bait, which is a higher pitch. And in either case, I'm not saying that's a negative or a positive. I think in some instances that silent sound can be better. In some instances, you might actually want a little bit more of that sound. um, so there are definitely some issues with respect to the wood. There are a handful of baits out there. Some of the ones that I still like, the Devil's Horse, most of them actually are more of your prop style baits. So you do still have a lot like the Brian's Bees out there. This is just one of your Topwater prop baits. There are some good walking baits out there. The one that I have gotten this in the thumbnail, this is a little Sting. This is just a little wood bait. I've got a buddy who makes some Topwater wooden poppers for me that run absolutely incredible. So there are definitely some out there, but man, they're becoming few and far between. And I don't know that it's necessarily um, completely warranted, but I do think that there's a lot of reasons we're moving away from the wooden baits. I think there's also probably a cost factor there. It's more expensive to have to hand carve a wooden bait than potentially come out with a plastic bait. And I would also say that I think a lot of companies, as much as sometimes they want to make wooden baits, what they find is there's inconsistencies within that wood, and therefore you might have one bait that performs different than another. And from a marketing and a production standpoint, that's not necessarily always a good thing. So I'm curious to know from you guys, what wooden topwater baits do you still use? Are you starting to go more towards plastic baits? And do you think the trend is warranted? Do you think overall the plastic baits tend to perform better? Let me know. I'm very curious what you guys have to say with this because it definitely looks like, from a production standpoint, wooden topwater baits are very, very quickly disappearing.